Today's presenter is Gus Cicala, President and CEO of Project Assistance. Gus Cicala founded Project Assistance in 1996 with the mission to make project failure obsolete. Gus is a recognized portfolio and project management expert who has published many popular articles and books on the subject and is frequently asked to present and teach topics of interest surrounding project management. Take it away, Gus.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. Some of you probably noticed the play on the title of our webinar today. We talk about true project leaders, and some of you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between a project manager and a project leader? We're going to learn about some new profession. And the answer is no. You know, we in our leadership course, we talk about the difference between managers and leaders. And when we get through this video that we show, we ask this question: so what are you, a manager or a leader? And the most common answer is both, right? So today we're going to talk about really both, but with an emphasis on the idea of project managers who are also leaders on the initiative that they're responsible for. So to that end, we're going to talk about project failure. So if we're going to be true leaders, how do we deal with this idea of making project failure obsolete? How can we prevent failure? We'll talk about 7 failures of project-based organizations, common failures, and then we'll talk about the 7 habits of true project leaders. That our definition of a strong leader is a project leader who can predict the behavior of a project when it's starting to go into failure mode, so that we can be proactive and intervene and to stop and prevent failure. Okay, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about how do we find these leaders? How do we identify these people? What kind of characteristics do they have? Okay, we'll leave some time, as Daniel talked about, so some question and answers at the end, and some parting gifts. I get 2 common questions. One I'll address right now. If somebody misses this or wants to share this webinar today, there will be a recording available on our website, typically in the next 24 hours. So let's talk about the dimensions of project failure. It says here that progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better. Because the subtitle of our mission statement, is to prevent project failure and make it obsolete. But our other mission, our submission breakdown goes to delivering the present. Delivering the future into the present. So we'll talk about that, right? How do we actually make those changes? How do we crowd out the current present and bring the future into the present? Okay, so dimensions of project failure. One is when projects go over budget, they fail. Oftentimes because the funding is not there, not always there to complete the project. When projects don't finish on time, they fail. Oftentimes there's a window of opportunity, and one of the ways they fail is we force it to finish on time, or we say we're on time, but we're not really done. Okay, so we can talk about that a little bit further down the slides. And when projects don't meet the specifications, they fail. And when the specs fall out of alignment from the business case, they fail. Okay, so these are common dimensions. If we talked about success, we would talk about on time, on budget, on spec, which is really what 3 and 4 is about. Okay, so our mission, as I said, is to make project failure obsolete. We prevent these dimensions of project failure by choosing influential leaders for our staffing project business line, as well as strong leaders for our consulting practice who can navigate complex company cultures and proactively identify predictable points that lead to project failure. So what we're really talking about today is how do we sense the symptoms of failure, and how do we become proactive from a leadership standpoint to the number of 7 habits we talk about today, how we apply them successfully in real projects. Okay, so let's talk about some failure modes in project-based organizations. One we see is closing the reality versus theory gap. Okay, so we know many of us are certified on the PMBOK, the project management professional certification. And what we've proven is that we understand the theory, okay? And sometimes there's a difficulty, what we call in our leadership course, predictable points of resistance. And you know, our failure to understand how to apply the theory in real situations leads to failure. And we'll talk about that. I believe that's habit number 7. Letting project managers breathe. We'll talk about that when we get to the habit about project control, right? So overwhelming our projects, our project managers with a burden of a slate that's just not realistic does lead to failure. Defining the problem before we solve it, right? So you know, we're going to talk about the word solution today, and we're going to recognize that solutions can only be valuable if the problem has been really identified appropriately. Nailing scope first. And you know, there are some confusing definitions of scope out there, right? So what we're talking about is not product scope or the specification. We're talking about project scope, which would be all 3 dimensions of success: the on time, the on budget, and the on spec. And how does a scope document address that? And why do projects fail when that's not done well? Performing risk management every time. It's not optional. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a measurable percentage of project managers and project leaders and project organizations on this call today that live in an organization where risk management is optional, and that is a recipe for disaster. We'll talk about that in one of the project habits. Communicating up, down, sideways. So the communication needs to be defined, right? We'll talk about that, but you know, it's like the old question about what are the 3 most important things about real estate, and they say location, location, location. And obviously, for the word for project management is communication, 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 and that means reality-based communication. So we'll talk about that. Managing scope creep. So not only nailing the scope, but also once we have that scope nailed, that we have a process, we have a capability, and so when we don't see scope managed appropriately, we see projects fail, and we'll definitely dive deeper into that concept. Okay, so our first poll today is, what do you think makes a great project manager? And this is a 1-question poll. Thirty seconds. We're going to give it about 10 more seconds. Wow. That's interesting. I can't disagree with the majority there. So thanks for your interaction. We'll definitely talk about strong interpersonal skills. We'll call it Gibson Golf. We'll get to that definition pretty soon. Okay. So the 7 habits. The individual who wants to reach the top in business must appreciate the might and force of habits. So we're going to talk about 7 habits as they apply to managers. Habit number 1, master the project charter. So we think about the project charter as the basis of the project, right? And what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for specific problems. With specific problems come specific solutions. So I already mentioned that in the failure mode. The building a solution without clarity of the problem is a tricky place to be. The perspective here is how do we do this well? I think about project managers really as consultants, and as good consultants, what we really are trying to do is ask the right questions, right? But what we can't do is give the right answers. We could recognize the right answer, we could recognize the wrong answer and ask a follow-up question, but at the end of the day, we can only get specific problems by asking the right questions. And how do we do that? Or how do we recognize the right answer? Well, let me give you one example. Is the problem defined in terms of what kind of outcomes we want to see if the problem is solved? In other words, is there a measurable capability around the problem? Is there ability to put metrics in there? Is there a good set of objectives in the project charter? The why we're doing this project, okay? And if we have a very strong why, we can work down the path of saying, well, if I have specific problems, now I can have a specific solution. If I get a specific solution, I can get a specific approach, okay? And these things have to happen in this kind of sequence, right? If I get a specific approach, now I can understand what I have to do, what the tasks are. If I know what the tasks are, I know what the skills are, okay? So what does that mean is, we can really build the definition of on time, on budget, on spec by going through this kind of logic and documenting this in a project charter. When does it happen? Well, usually we'd like to see this happen, and oftentimes we're asked to do this at the demand generation, right? When we're looking at the business relationship we have to our constituents, to our customers, how many projects are we trying to do, and which ones are the right projects? So a lot of times a project charter is intended to give these vectors or these measurements of the business case, right? So it's not just a technical skill, to draft a charter, right? It's a solid, detailed approach, and we're going to talk about that in the second habit, about how the technical skill comes in to play and how we solve this problem by putting the right solution. Okay, so the real question is, if we have standards around project charters, we have the ability to look at a funnel of demand of solutions that are needed by the business and say which ones are the best ones, which ones have the greatest value, right? So we have to really understand the culture that we have, the processes that we have, the executive support we have to really standardize how we make comparisons on a multiple set of project charters to come out with the right answer. Now, is there always a project manager writing a charter? I'd like to think so, yes. Some organizations would call this, prior to a project charter, something like a PRF, a project request form. So the question is, how do we take these requests for solutions to solve problems, and how do we turn that into a standard way to compare project charters and come up with the right answer, and also build the foundation for the more detailed planning that has to happen when the project actually starts. Okay, so we have this kind of a chicken and the egg problem, right? We've got this world where the portfolio gets defined, and I put these 4 verbs here: propose, select, measure, respond. The selection process relies on an understanding of, well, what is the best project, right? How do we make sure there's not a disconnect between what gets defined in the portfolio strategy process versus the execution process, right? So when this portfolio process unfolds, typically we're trying to say, well, what are the right projects? What are the best projects? Typically have optimal risk, They have the highest return on investment. They're the most cost-effective, not the cheapest necessarily, but the most cost-effective. How about alignment to the organization's vision? How about the ideal timing from a schedule standpoint? Not the fastest, but the ideal timing, right? What's the market need, the specification? What's the feasibility from the resource standpoint, from the risk standpoint, for all these other vectors? So really the right projects can only be selected by having this information that we would hopefully find in a project charter, okay? And then, when we get to execution, now we got the right projects. Now, how do we say done right, right? So this capability to say, now we can deliver on time and on budget and on spec. And the disconnect oftentimes is, have we done enough homework at the portfolio level to have a confidence that when we go to deliver on the budget and the timing, the schedule and the specification, was there enough due diligence in the portfolio selection that these things are not going to change, that we find out when we start doing more detailed investigation around the budget, around the schedule, around the real requirements for the solution, about the real problem that we're trying to solve. Do we find that there's a disconnect? And unfortunately, there is oftentimes a disconnect between what happened 6 months ago on a flyby of a large number of projects that maybe had a swag, and now we're delivered, sort of a locked-in budget and have to deal with the reality of that disconnect, right? So the chicken and the egg, I'm going to talk a little bit more about when we get to habit number 2. So really, the question is, what questions should a project charter answer, right? How do we recognize the sequence that has to happen to go from saying, well, why are we doing this, or what's the problem, and how will we do the work? How are we going to solve the problem? What are the deliverables going to be? When will we be done? What's the completion criteria? What's the budget? What don't we know? What are the assumptions we're going to make, right? Who's going to do the work? What are the resources? What's the completion criteria? What can go wrong, which is risk management? So we, the real question is, how much of this can we know when we're taking on demand into a funnel of projects? And as how can we support our project management community to be able to, given the opportunity, to come up with the right answers and to have these things not get off kilter? So that really, comes to this question of habit number 2, for the project manager. A strong project manager will demand a strong architect. And when I think about architect, I'm not talking about IT. I'm talking about, in a general sense, the sort of the blueprint of the solution, right? Who's the expert that knows how to build a solution around the problem that we're trying to solve? Okay, so what does that really mean? It means we have not only project leadership, but also solution leadership. We have strong, that we demand as project managers. If you think about the bottom of this pyramid here, we really have 2 methodologies that are happening during execution. We've got the on time, on budget for project and program management, and then we've got the life cycle, or the SDLC, the solution delivery life cycle management, that delivers on spec. How do I get a specification? How do I specify the design, the build, the test, the delivery of the solution? Okay, what tasks are going to be there? The first question in the last slide said about the why of the problem. Now the question is the how, right? And how am I going to deliver this solution without an architect that says, I know how to solve this problem? Here is the approach. Here are the tasks. A lot of times this comes from a methodology. We'll talk about that in a minute, right? So we got the PM methodology versus the design and build methodology, or what I would call the deliverable methodology. How do we deliver the solution? So the project manager really shouldn't, in most cases, is not intended to be the subject matter expert from a technical standpoint to say, what exactly do we have to do to build this approach? Because this approach, this work breakdown structure, is the foundation of the schedule, of the budget, of the resources and the skills that are required. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, when we talk about a solution, we're talking about solving. Who's going to solve it? First, again, to emphasize, the strong problem definition is the foundation of a strong solution definition. So the definition of success, of on time, on budget, on spec, the real question is, how does a project leader drive that accountability? And a lot of times, the science of project management on time, on budget, sometimes doesn't go strong enough into the on spec, right? Because the on spec is really the definition of the expected value of solving the problem, right? So the spec meets the original business case. The ongoing validation of the cost-benefit analysis is validated throughout the project. How do we do that? Right? How do we as project managers and solution architects keep our eye beyond the on time and the on budget and really keep an eye on how do we achieve the measurable objectives of the project? Okay, so a lot of times that's a little bit hard to quantify. It's a little hard to measure. And the real question is, do we have the wherewithal at the beginning of the project to ensure that this foundation is built? Okay, so what am I talking about with methodologies? Well, you know, the project management, I call that the horizontal. It cuts across all types of builds, right? The project management is the business controls, the on time, the on schedule, the on budget, with the cost. And we have just some examples here of IT methodologies, product development methodologies, which you might call them product lifecycle management, or NPD, new product development. A flavor of that would be life sciences, you know, working with the FDA or other regulatory agencies across the globe on top of how we deliver new solutions to diseases, to the healthcare of our population, right? Architectural engineering design, real architects, right, that have real blueprints are the ones that tell us how we're going to build this building, right? How do we build that rocket ship or that fighter aircraft or that passenger jet that's going to go out there? Or, you know, the other solution is just corporate initiatives. How do we solve problems at the company level, at the highest level of the organization, where we're transforming the entire organization? So these are just some examples, right? I need architects to tell me what task, what's the breakdown structure, what is the specific solution specified for this type of problem. And that's a habit that project managers have to demand, right? We need the best architects. Habit number 3, don't gamble with other people's money. I said this in the beginning on the 7 modes of failure, that risk management is not optional. I find it interesting that PMBOK calls out risk management as one of the knowledge areas, and I kind of think it a little bit differently. Project management is a flavor of risk management, not the other way around. That's how strong I feel about risk management. Okay, so don't gamble with other people's money. What does that mean? Well, a couple things. Leadership's not always bravery and fortitude, right? Caution rules here, right? So the question is, this is not being so brave that we're going to take risks that are not really a good idea, right? Or that we're not even aware of what the risks are. This is a tough exercise, right? When we get the call to get, you know, can we bring a risk management process? Can you train our project managers on project risk management? One of the questions I ask is, are we giving them license to hunt? Are we really asking our project managers to bring forth in a proactive way what can go wrong? Because what that means is we're going to have to try to prevent it. And what that means is if we're going to prevent it, we're going to mitigate, we're probably going to spend money up front. It's like selling insurance. And insurance is not a popular subject, right? I think about insurance in two modes. You can have it or not, right? Let's talk about those 2 modes. Let's say I choose not to have insurance. There's 2 outcomes. Something happens, goes wrong, you'd like to file a claim, but you can't, or you get lucky and nothing happens, right? So if we have no insurance and nothing happens, there's no cost. If we have no insurance and something happens, that's a really bad outcome. Let's talk about buying insurance. I buy insurance and I need it or I don't. Let's see, I need it. Yay, I have a claim. Is that great? No. I buy insurance and nothing happens. Well, that's probably the best outcome, but we're spending money that never produced any tangible benefit other than the fact that we didn't fail. Okay, so in all those four modes, they're all unpopular. Having no insurance and have nothing happen, bad idea. No insurance, something happens, bad idea, right? So you go through every scenario, and really, buying insurance is not a popular topic. It's not that easy, right? So risk management is not optional. However, that means spending money, right? So the other thing is, when I look at a lot of organizations, when I'm in a risk management discussion, a presentation, I'll ask the audience, how many people, or I'll say it actually different. What's the most common path that project-based organizations take when it comes to risk management? And the most common answer I get is no insurance, hope nothing happens. Okay, so the question is, if that's the world we're living in project-based organizations, I'm not talking about all projects. I mean, if we're doing drug development and we're going to have an adverse event and kill a human being with a clinical trial, there's risk management there. I understand that, right? But in a lot of projects, the risk management is optional, oftentimes because we don't want to hear what can go wrong from an organizational standpoint. So you get lucky for a while, but the odds catch up. Statistically, things will go wrong, and so how do we stand up to a company culture? Once again, from a leadership standpoint, how do I get to apply this theory in the world of reality? So, what is your organization's approach to risk management? Encouraging so far. We're at 30 seconds. We're going to get 10 more seconds if anybody wants to vote. Congratulations. The majority said they risk are identified, analyzed, and mitigated.
The plurality, at least.
Yeah, so a plurality, is that what that's called? Not a majority? Interesting. So risk are identified but not analyzed or mitigated. I actually expected that to be higher. I have seen, I remember one specific customer I talked to, I said, we're customizing our risk management deck to their situation. So what do you do with risk management? We don't do anything with it. Why not? Well, we had a risk management process, but I got rid of it. Why? Because we had a stage gate process and we did risk identification and then we never did anything more. So I killed the whole process. I said, okay, that makes sense. If we're going to identify and not do anything about it, that's probably not really a risk management process. That's a partial risk management process. So it's good to see that that was in the minority. Okay, so the risk management process flow is the whole flow we just talked about on the poll, right? We have planning risk management, which is really a project management activity. How do we plan for a specific project? How do we identify risk? Oftentimes through a checklist or a brainstorming, and oftentimes both, okay? Perform qualitative risk analysis, which is the most common. Perform quantitative risk analysis, which is less common, more of an actuarial approach, a measurement of impact and probability, right? Just like an insurance company would do. A lot of organizations don't have the data to do that. So qualitative, we're talking about high, medium, low impact, high, medium, low probability, and looking at how those two things come together, right? So if I have a high impact and a high probability risk, maybe I should do something about it, right? So the responses run the gamut from ignore and accept through mitigate and plan to reduce the risk, right? So, or contingencies, which is actually sort of proactively issue managing. And I could go deeper into that, but we don't have enough time for that today. So But what I really want to talk about is when you think about accepting risk, this is the one I really don't like very much, okay? So when we plan risk responses, we'll see even an organization that's good with risk management typically deals with the high impact, high probability, and maybe the mediums. The lows, low, probably not, low, medium, maybe not, and a few low probability, high impact, we'll see some mitigation, but due to the cost of mitigating low probability events, oftentimes they'll be accepted. And they're the ones I hate the most. Because when we think about monitoring and controlling risks, it's hard to understand what's happening throughout the project and get the timing of how we're going to get a plan in place, right? So, so the definition of risk analysis is the process of assigning relative degrees of likelihood and impact to each risk, right? So a lot of times this sort of qualitative piece is relative degrees, high, medium, low, right? Or I call it the Goldilocks approach. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. Not too hard, not too soft, just right, right? So that's, so the risk analysis is key because, all risks are not created equal. The answer to this question is risks are not created equal, right? So how do we sort these things out, and how do we decide what we're going to do about this? And, dealing with low probability, high impact is really one of my least favorite things, right? What are the chances of, a meteor striking the Earth during your project, and do you have a plan for it? And most times the answer is no. Electromagnetic pulse, coronal mass ejection from the sun. How many people are really spending any time on dealing with that, right? So my rule is low probability, high impact, mitigate it if the cost is low, right? Sometimes we can mitigate a high impact risk by making a small investment. So we really have to think about that third vector, right? When we analyze this, ultimately the cost of mitigating is going to be a factor, right? So this is the damned if you do, damned if you don't thing, right? It's just, it says, this is one of my favorite far sides. Come on, it's one or the other, so this is, the real problem about this is when we accept low probability, high impact risks, they sometimes happen. And now the question is, why did you not have a plan? Why did you accept it? And you said, we just deemed it's low probability. And what does the executive sponsor say at this point? How could you possibly think it was low probability? What I just saw was 100%. It just happened, right? So this is damned if you do, damned if you don't. Spending money on low probability events is tricky, right? So, and this, I just put this here because it's a PMBOK definition. It's a little bit aged, obviously, but I put this in here because of sort of so many words to talk about planning. Risk response planning is a process of developing options and determining actions to enhance opportunities and reduce threats to the project's objectives. Risk response planning must be appropriate to the severity of the risk, which I call impact, cost-effective in meeting the challenge, timely to be successful, realistic within the project context, agreed by all parties, and owned by a responsible person. What does that mean? The conditions have to be pretty optimal to make risk management planning work well, right? So this is not easy to do, all right? So it's a good habit. It's a tough habit. Let's talk about strong attention to detail. I think this is probably the most undervalued or unrecognized capability for project managers, strong attention to detail. A lot of times what I see is when I talked about letting project managers breathe, the real question is strong attention to detail is really the concept of how do we establish control in a project during execution. It's called monitoring and control, right? And what that means is having a lot of detail about what's happening in my project, right? So it's about flawless execution. Execution means we do the control activities, right? So the minutia of the project matters, right? And I can tell you right now, I have a book on Microsoft Project. It's the last thing I want to do is to go into a 500-task project and update it every week, right? But the minutia matters. The minutes matter, right? The action items list updated matters. The weekly status reports or monthly status reports matter. The team meetings and the agendas that have to be appropriate and on time. Okay, so accomplishing project control through cadence and rhythm is difficult, especially if I'm running 5 projects. Okay, so it's a soft skill, and soft skills are tough to judge, right? So it's not easily found on a resume. It's not easily trained. It's something that project managers that are good project managers recognize, that saying that this is administrivia detail and that's below me is the wrong answer, right? So the habit is the habit to say, we've got to do this, we've got to see the benefit, that in fact, this idea of control is an objective measure, right? Either you are or you are not doing the control activities on a regular cyclical basis. If you're not doing these things, like tracking actual progress and analyzing variances to a baseline, assuming you have a baseline, okay, proactively managing risks and issues, controlling scope changes, communicate. If we're not doing these on a regular cyclical basis, which is probably weekly, by objective definition, we are out of control. Okay, so control doesn't mean success, right? Can I be in control and deliver over budget and late? Yes. Control says I know where we are, down to the grind, up-to-date reality is what we have. Okay, can I be out of control and deliver on time on budget? To that definition, yes, with the caveat, you're not doing anything if you're not doing control. So if it comes in on time on budget, I guess somebody else must have filled the leadership gap. Okay, habit number 5, enables communication. And that picture on the bottom there is, you probably heard this, that God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I put this on here because this picture of control and this idea of communication, when I heard about that, I thought, well, you know, that's pretty easy. I do a status report every month. And what I found out is that there's a number of things that I was not doing if I was putting out a status report. If I was sending a status report that had issues in it to an executive sponsor, my executive sponsor wasn't reading that. And I wasn't figuring out what their communication preference was or how to get to them. I'll come back to that in a minute. I was not talking about communication protocols. Let me give you a quick example. What's the definition of an issue? A risk that happened. Oh, okay. How do I find out that this risk turned into an issue? Is the project manager always first to find out? Probably not. If somebody else on the team finds out about it, who do they talk to first? Well, if we have a communication plan, the answers come to the project manager, not to the customer, not to the stakeholder. Why do we do that? Because if we have an issue, we're going to have a mitigation plan. We're going to have a response to that issue. If we talk to the stakeholder before we start managing the issue, we've got a problem. So I found out that communication was an intricate thing to do. I was taught to have a communication plan. I was taught to understand how we're going to communicate with the sponsor, right? So this idea is not just communication skills, it's communication planning structure for everyone to communicate flawlessly. And the communication is not just the responsibility of the project manager, it's the responsibility of managing people who are all going to do communication and how that's going to happen, right? So it's an airtight process and it needs to be flawlessly executed. So poll number 3. So this poll here is the foundation of what I'm going to ask next time, because this next slide, because I'm going to get into this question about how do we build a relationship with a stakeholder who is going to be oftentimes hard to find, very busy, executive. So how long does it take to build the foundation of a relationship between 2 people? Build the foundation is the key words.
Twice instead of years.
Say again?
I accidentally put days in there twice instead of an option for years.
Okay, so ignore the last one.
So we can say months plus.
Or if you put days, we'll add them together. We're at 1 minute, so almost everybody's awake. More than half, more than 2/3. Interesting. So it's either minutes, weeks, or months. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about is building the foundation of a relationship, you know, and if you ever dealt with the word rapport, and if you look at, you know, sort of the root of rapport, it comes from a French word about reflection, right? That we have a common bond, that when I look in the mirror, I see myself. I see somebody who cares about me. Rapport is returning back to somebody. Okay, so when I talk about communications, one of the challenges we have is with executives, and I worked at IBM Professional Services in the late 80s and early 90s. That was hardly a word at IBM when we were a mainframe manufacturer for computers. But back in the day, it was taken pretty seriously about how we do communication to executives. And one thing I was told is we should always copy the executive every month, even if they're not going to be called to do anything. But the other thing I was also taught was how to build a relationship with an executive sponsor. And what I found out is that I found out in a few minutes I could start build the foundation of a relationship. And I want to talk about that. One of the questions we would have is, you know, when do we see an executive sponsor? If I could have put that as a poll here too. When am I going to see an executive sponsor? It would probably be scarcely. And I'm not making painting stakeholders as people who are not on purpose not available, but they have a lot of responsibility, and sometimes we have to figure out how to get them engaged. So one of the things I've seen is, what is our common bond? And what I have found out is a lot of executive sponsors and stakeholders are not project management experts. You know, they're a little nervous that they're responsible for this project. They don't really know how to make sure that everything's going to be okay. So my common bond is, I know how to do this. I'm a project leader. I'm a trained professional, right? So one question is, will the executive be at the kickoff? And if so, how do we leverage that opportunity? And the first couple times I did this, it occurred to me that sometimes they come late, often, and sometimes they leave early, often, at least in my experience. So I had this opportunity, but if they come in late and they leave early, what do? I stop the meeting. So I'm going to say, you know, hey, guess what, folks? Susie Q's coming to I'm expecting our executive sponsor to join us today, and when he or she leaves the room, we're going to take a 10-minute break. And I follow them to the elevator and I say, I'm a trained professional, I've got your back. Right? I understand project management. We've got a scope, we've got a schedule, we've got a budget. I'm responsible, I'm accountable and responsible for the on-time, on-budget specifications to solve your business problem, to deliver the value you expect, and to make sure everything is successful. But I'm going to need your help sometimes. Okay? So I'm going to leave you out of this, but how do I get to you if I need your help? And what I have found is, when I'm telling you I'm a trained professional, I've got your back, that you're responding to me in a positive way. And I've gotten some very interesting answers. My favorite answer was, I'm hard to get during the week, but if it can wait till Saturday morning, call me between 8 and 10. That's when I'm dealing with my Saturday pile that I couldn't get done during Monday through Friday. So an issue comes up 3 months later. I call Bob. Bob picks up the phone. I tell him we've got a problem, and he swings into action Monday morning, and things are getting flattened. Decisions are being made, and some of the problems we're having with scope were resolved. Right? So just a thought about, you know, how do we really understand how people want to be communicated, and understand our role and how we help them help us. Okay, habit number 6. Stubbornly sticks to reality. Now, the problem with reality is we go through the 5 stages of grief, because one of the realities is that we're seeing these symptoms of failure, some of the things we talked about today, and they're difficult to deal with, right? So the real question is, how do we really take this sort of Zen approach to say, it just is, you know, and what is what we have to share with the rest of the world, and how do we deal with that, right? So the ideal project manager oftentimes is a lousy politician, right? Politicians have a great way of putting a sort of a positive spin on bad news, and that's, you know, I mean, we can try to not make it as worse than it is, but we probably don't want to make it sound optimistic if it's not optimistic, right? So how do we deal with that? We don't aspire optimism, to tell the real truth. Now, there's ways to do that, right? I mean, there's certainly the idea of generating options and recommendations, right? So fit the plan to reality, not the vice versa. What do I mean by that? Let's talk about that gap between the portfolio that got approved, the budget that got locked in, the schedule that got locked in, the scope and specification of the solution has been locked in. And now I get the approval and I do my detailed planning and it's out of sync, okay? Or that first request for scope change comes in and we say, no, we can't accept this because we got this thing called a triple constraint. And when you give me more scope, it's going to affect my resources and my schedule, and we've got to deal with that reality. Okay, so the real thing that happens a lot is we're asked to be a good sport. Give it the old college try. Be a team member. Be a supporter. So that's hard to do sometimes, right? So the original baseline is in the past, right? So exceptional project managers pull it off with what we call gifts and gall. Good interpersonal skills, gets along with everyone, but also understands project management, has the data, has the backup, has the ability to say, here's why we're saying this cannot be done, and we have to deal with it now. Or, here's another question I like to ask in a room full of project managers. Is bad news like cheese and wine? Does it get better with time? Does bad news get better with time? And the answer is no, right? So the thing that we do, which is really not human, is we seek pain early. Seeking pain means delivering bad news as early as possible and dealing with it in an appropriate way, right? So stubbornly sticking to the reality is, the real problem is we get resistance when we talk about reality. We can't expand the scope. We can't add money. We can't move the schedule. Right, so we've got to figure out how we're going to deal with this, right? So what we really talk about is, I call it getting beyond the PMP, right? The PMP validates your functional management skill, project management skills, right? It's the price of admission to have these capabilities to understand the theory. But the real question is, how do I apply it, right? How do I have these leadership skills around the interpersonal, the keen judgment, the collaboration, relationship building, analytical, which is not something our DNA has sometimes. It's hard to be a leader in a technical environment if we're not analytical and come up with creative solutions to problems, right? Persuasive negotiator, effective trade-offs. Usually it's not a free ride, right? We're gonna go in a direction, but it comes at a price. How do we deal with that negotiation, that compromise? Okay, so critical competencies. We know what the PMP talks about in terms of being able to ply our trade, what I would call the process of project management, right? Or the functions of functional skills, as it says here. And then we also have this critical competencies around the leadership skills as well, right? So I call this my unique fingerprint, my constellation of skills. When we're screening project managers for our staffing opportunities, we get into scenario based to say, tell me how what out of these skills, what are your strengths? How do you bring your experience and your capabilities to say we're moving into a failure mode and we've got to get out of reverse? We're in a hole. We need to stop digging. How do we have those conversations? So if a project management coroner performed a post-mortem on your organization's failed projects, what would be the findings as a common pattern in the cause of death? I'm going to give you my answer. Your answer may be different. That's okay. Interesting. We're approaching 30 seconds. I'll give about 10 more seconds. Got quite a spread here. Wow, interesting.
Guess they picked good options.
It would be interesting to, how many of these are happening at the same time. We know that happens as well, so it's a little hard to pick one. So our answer today, survey says, scope creep we're going to talk about, okay? And the reason I pick on this is this question that came out in a book a long, long time ago, now politically incorrect. It's titled The Mythical Man Month. And the question in the book was, how does a large project get to be 1 year late? And the answer is 1 day at a time, right? How do we deal with these small changes over time? And, if we talk about, the other question I would ask, it would be interesting to do a poll, what percentage of projects will experience a scope change? The most common I get from project management communities, from PMOs, from PMO directors, CIOs, developer, or product managers, is 100%. So if I go into a kickoff and I say, you know what, this project has a 100% chance to have a scope change, so we're going to have to do a scope change process, we get this kind of NIMBY answer. You know what NIMBY stands for, right? Not my backyard, right? We need prisons, we need nuclear plants, but guess what? We also need scope changes, but not on my project. Why are you imposing this on me? I'm not imposing it on you. I'm telling you, in my experience, scope changes happen, and we're going to have to deal with them. So the question is, why be proactive about this? If that's a reality, if that's one of the highest risks to deal with scope management or scope changes, how am I going to deal with that, right? So we get, the impact of the first mention of the threat to the triple constraint model in the kickoff is not popular, right? So we're talking about the impact to good, fast, cheap. You only get two if something changes, right? So the impact analysis is something we have to predict. If we're going to have scope changes, we have to plan for impact analysis, right? If the budget for impact analysis, we may have a small change about budget. We may have a proactive. Hey, I can do up to 40 hours or $10,000 of changes. That's already in the budget. We have a contingency, but once we get beyond that, we've got to do something about it. So yes, we're going to do impact analysis, and we're going to build that to the project, and then we get this old, well, now you're nickel and diming me. I'm going to hold my breath till I'm not happy. I'm going to call people above you and override you. And all these things happen sometimes, right? So the impact of the second change order, it's not a walk in the park, but if we hold to our guns, we can get this to work well, right? So during execution, I call it the hand grenade, right? The small change, the project change request, the effectiveness of sponsor single point of contact for scope changes. A lot of times what I'll see, if I get a single point of contact, they'll start to manage the scope for me. If we say we've got a limited impact analysis budget, and we can only do so much, we'll oftentimes get a response of, we'll try to kill some of this stuff, okay? So that's the 7 habits. In terms of finding these project leaders, I talked about this a little bit. It takes intimate knowledge to find exceptional leaders. So one of the things we do is really try to do an investigation of soft skills, and that's hard to evaluate, right? We talk about success and results-oriented interviews. When I ask questions about how you took a project that was off the rails and got it back on the rails and got it on track, and what unique skills did you use, I get some really great stories that you really can't make up, right? So scenario-based is the way to go. Situations where you apply functional skills in compromising situations, which means we're using our reality. Sometimes I don't get some great answers, and it takes my hair trigger BS meter, then maybe this is not a real leader, right? So that's kind of how we do it. And we also do that through our community practice, but we're running out of time, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. What we're going to do is, if we have any questions, we'll start to talk about some of those questions. While you're thinking about your questions, our next webinar will be scheduled for February 21st, and how to build a project management office using Microsoft Project as a foundation. That's one of the things we do. We're a Microsoft partner. We're experts on Project Server, Project Online. So if you have an interest in how Microsoft Project supports the mission of the Project Management Office, we'll be talking about that in 2 months. And we have 2 minutes left.
Excellent, thank you so much. So feel free to use the question and answer console as we covered at the beginning of the webinar. We already have a couple of questions coming in. So one is, how do you apply 7 habits to project management training?
How do you apply the 7 habits of project management training? That's a good one. So it really depends on the focus, right? When we do project management training, it's most often customized to the environment of our customer. So the 7 habits straddle the functional skills as well as the soft skills. So primarily we have the sort of the project management theory training that covers the functional part, and then we also have a leadership workshop that really gets to the soft skills, and it goes through a theory we have in our leadership that I developed I was in part of a book about 5 years ago, and I developed this theory called predictable points of resistance. We can predict where we're going to get resistance. We can predict where, when we try to apply our theoretical PMBOK knowledge, that we will get real resistance in the organization. And so what we talk about is how we use those soft skills to be effective to overcome the resistance, because if we don't overcome the resistance, what happens is, and I call them defining moments as well, the defining moment is we've now allowed that project to come off the tracks and it's probably going to fail. Hope that helps.
The next question is a bit long. I'll summarize the best I can. Essentially asking around the business case in the project portfolio stage. What sort of trends are you seeing there? Is people concerned they don't have that in their own organization? Yeah,
the trend is, I don't see a lot of project managers or a lot of, maybe I'd say portfolio processes where the project manager, and I talked about the architect as well, has a pulse on the business case itself. That we have, do we have the real measurements of the cost-benefit analysis, and B, during execution, do we get beyond sort of what Microsoft Project does, right? Project will sort of give you the variances on your dates and your budget and your labor, but the real question is, if we're spending all the money and using up all the time, are we still delivering the value? And the real answer is, if you look at the sort of the penultimate result of doing portfolio management well, is called benefits realization, and that is where the error is rare.
Excellent, and that's all the questions we have coming in.